military analyst, and every person watching the news right now is asking in every language on earth, did Iran just do what nobody believed any nation was capable of doing to the United States military? 3 American soldiers are dead. 5 more are fighting for their lives in military hospitals somewhere in the Middle East right now, as you are listening to this. And the United States government is standing in front of the entire world and saying that nothing happened to their most powerful warship, even as Iran is saying something entirely different. Even as Iran is describing, with specific and deliberate precision, exactly how they struck that ship, and with exactly how many missiles and from exactly what direction. So who is telling the truth? That is the question, sitting at the absolute center of the most dangerous 48 hours the world has lived through in a very long time. A conflict that began as a military operation, and within hours became something that no one involved in it can now fully predict or fully control. And by the time you finish listening to ever why single word of this, you will understand exactly what happened, what is still being held back from the public, and why this one moment, 3 American soldiers dead, 1 contested aircraft carrier, and 1 truth that is still being fought over, could redirect the course of history in ways that the people currently making the decisions are not fully prepared for. Let's go back to before it started. Because this did not begin on February 28th. That was the day it became visible. But the preparation for what happened on that Saturday had been building for months, and understanding what was built and why and how tells you everything about how we arrived at 3 coffins and an aircraft carrier in the middle of contested water. The USS Abraham Lincoln is a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It is over 1,000 feet long. It weighs close to 100,000 tons when fully loaded. It houses approximately 5,000 sailors, officers, pilots, and support personnel. It carries dozens of the most advanced combat aircraft on Earth, FA-18. Super Hornets, electronic warfare aircraft, helicopters, and surveillance planes. It is powered by 2 nuclear reactors. It can operate at sea for years without refueling. It travels everywhere with a ring of protection around it. Guided missile destroyers, attack submarines running silent beneath the surface, and layered air defense systems that cost billions of dollars and represent the most sophisticated defensive technology that American military engineering has been able to produce across generations of development. That ship had been in the North Arabian Sea for weeks before February 28th. It did not go there by accident. The United States had been assembling WH military analysts, described as the largest concentrated American military presence in the Middle East in more than 2 decades. The Abraham Lincoln arrived at the end of January with 3 guided missile destroyers. Then the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's single largest aircraft carrier, a ship even more massive than the Abraham Lincoln, a vessel that represents the absolute cutting edge of naval aviation, was pulled from the Caribbean Sea and ordered east. The Ford had just participated in the operation that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, an operation that Trump described as going into a heavily protected military fortress and coming out successfully. 4 more destroyers came with the Ford as it moved toward the Gulf. Hold a picture of that for a moment. 2 of the world's most powerful aircraft carriers positioned in the same region at the same time. 7 destroyers, submarines, Air Force assets based in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and Jordan. Ground force as distributed across a network of bases, intelligence and surveillance assets operating around the clock, the logistical and financial scale of what the United States moved into the region in those weeks before February 28th is almost impossible to describe in a way that fully captures its weight. This was not a show of force designed to open space for negotiation. This was final preparation. On February 28th, everything that had been prepared moved together. Before the sun rose over the Arabian Sea, FA-18 Super Hornets lifted off the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck in darkness, their engines leaving trails of heat across the night sky as they climbed north toward Iranian territory. At the exact same moment, coordinated down to the minute, Israeli forces launched what Israel would later confirm was the largest single aerial operation in the entire recorded history of the Israeli military. Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion. The United States called their it Operation Epic Fury. Together, they struck Iran from multiple directions simultaneously, from the sea and from the air, from north and south and west, specifically engineered to overwhelm Iran's air defense systems before any single installation could get a full picture of the scope of what was coming at them. The targets had been selected and studied over months. Iranian military command and control centers, the facilities where orders are given, where communications flow, where the military's ability to organize a response lives. Leadership, bunkers, the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most powerful military and political institution, an organization so deeply embedded in Iranian society and economy that it functions more like a shadow government than a military branch. Iranian Navy submarines sitting at their moorings in Chabahar and Bandar Abbas, unable to submerge and escape before the strikes arrived. Long-range missile batteries, air defense radar sites, underground facilities, associated with Iran's most sensitive programs. The strikes were designed to simultaneously accomplish two things that rarely go together in military operations: destroy Iran's capacity to fight back in a sustained way, and eliminate the specific people at the top of Iran's decision-making structure before they could adapt, relocate, and regroup. What happened next was not expected, even by the people who had planned every other detail of that morning. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the man who had held absolute religious and political authority over a nation of 90 million people for 33 years, the man whose interpretation of Islamic law was considered binding on the entire state, the man whose portrait appeared in every government building, every school, every military installation across Iran, was killed, not wounded in a strike and evacuated to a hospital, not forced underground into a bunker from which he would emerge days later to rally his country. Killed. In the first hours of Operation Epic Fury, the single most powerful figure in the Iranian state, the person at the absolute apex of the system that Iran had built and maintained for decades, was gone. Trump confirmed in public statements that 48 senior Iranian leaders were killed in those initial strikes. Iran's own judiciary acknowledged the deaths of Ali Shamkhani, a man who had sat in Iran's highest councils for decades and served as one of Khamenei's most trusted and most senior advisors, and General Mohammed, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's ground forces. The people who had spent entire careers building Iran's military capability, shaping its regional strategy, managing its alliances, and making the decisions that determined Iran's behavior across the Middle East for a generation, they were systematically found and systematically eliminated within hours. No words existed in the immediate aftermath that were adequate to describe the scale of what had just happened. The world went very still. Inside Iran, the reaction divided in ways that revealed something honest and uncomfortable about what 4 decades of that government had created. In some neighborhoods in Tehran and other cities, Iranians who had lived their entire lives under a government that enforced religious law with violence, that arrested women for showing their hair, that executed gay people, that imprisoned opposition figures and tortured them, that shot protesters in the street during the 2019 and 2022 uprisings and left them to die on the pavement. Some of those Iranians came into the streets and celebrated openly when the news spread that Khamenei was dead. Videos circulated on social media of people dancing, of people weeping with a kind of relief that looked different from grief. In a country where public dissent had been punished with imprisonment and death for 3 decades, people were standing in public and celebrating the end of the man who had ordered all of it. But in other streets of the same country, the reaction was entirely different. Pro-government crowds formed within hours, marching, chanting, demanding that the blood of their supreme leader be met with American blood. The split inside Iran was not new. It had been building through the 2009 Green Movement, through the 2019 gasoline protests, through the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising that followed the death of Mahsa Amini. But it had never been this visible, this immediate, and this geographically concentrated in the hours following a single event. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared before cameras looking shaken and declared the killing of Khamenei a declaration of war against all Muslims everywhere on earth. He warned that Iran considered it a legitimate and sacred duty to respond, and that the response would come. The Revolutionary Guards issued their own statement, promising retaliatory action on a scale that would make clear to America what the cost of this operation would be. Before Saturday was over, they had begun delivering on that promise. The missiles did not come in a single manageable wave. They came in sustained, overlapping, simultaneous attacks across an entire region at once. Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones at American military assets and at civilian infra. A structure across the Middle East in a coordinated campaign that unfolded across multiple countries at the exact same time. Israel was targeted, Jordan was targeted, the United Arab Emirates was targeted, Saudi Arabia was targeted, Qatar was targeted, Bahrain was targeted, Iraq was targeted. The geographic scope of Iran's retaliation, the sheer number of different countries being struck by Iranian weapons in the same window of time, left military analysts watching in real time genuinely struggling to describe what they were looking at. A nation that had just lost its supreme leader and its most senior military commanders within a single morning was still coordinating one of the most complex multi-theater, simultaneous strike campaigns that modern warfare had produced. U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Manama, Bahrain, the command center from which the United States manages its entire naval presence in the Gulf, the nerve center of American maritime power in the region, was targeted. Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which houses thousands of American military personnel and serves as one of the most operationally critical American military installations anywhere in the world. D was struck. Iranian weapons did not limit themselves to military installations. They expanded into civilian infrastructure. Hotels received direct hits. Commercial ports were struck. Residential neighborhoods were caught in the attacks. Iran was demonstrating something specific, that the costs of this conflict would not be contained to military personnel and military assets alone. It doesn't need your laptop. They just need their code to reach that database. And they can do that from anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, another researcher entered the picture. An ethical hacker named Alexander Hagena decided to go one step further. He built a tool, a proof-of-concept program, that could automatically find the recall database on any computer, copy all of its contents, extract all the screenshots, search through all the stored text, and generate a full report of everything Recall had captured. He named this tool Total Recall, a nod to the classic 1990 science fiction film. He described what he found in the database in simple, clear, deeply alarming language. He said the database is unencrypted. P-TED. He said it's all plain text. He said Windows Recall stores everything locally in a completely open SQLite database. He released Total Recall publicly on GitHub to demonstrate the problem, not to enable attacks, but to force Microsoft to face the reality of what TY had built. He said he wanted to see what Microsoft would do about it before the official launch date. The specific location of this database, for those who want to check on their own machines, was this: C:\users / your username / appdata / local / core AI platform.00 /UKP / followed by a long unique ID. All the screenshots were stored in a subfolder inside that location. All the text was sitting in a database file. And Total Recall's test run on a real machine found something that tells you everything you need to know about what Recall captures. In one test session, Total Recall extracted data from 166 captured windows, 46 images taken, and when it searched the database for the single word password, it returned 32 results. 32 moments where the word password appeared on that user's screen, all saved, all readable, all sitting there waiting to be stolen. The fallout was immediate. The security community exploded. Privacy advocates published detailed warnings. The press covered it widely, and governments started paying attention. The United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office, the official national data watchdog, announced in May 2024 that it was formally making inquiries with Microsoft to assess what privacy protections were actually built into Recall. Let that sink in for a moment. A government regulator in one of the largest economies in the world had to officially ask a trillion-dollar technology company to explain how a feature on their operating system was protecting ordinary citizens' personal data. That is not a normal situation. That is what happens when something goes this wrong, this fast. And then the messaging app, Signal. One of the most trusted private communication tools in the world, used by journalists, activists, lawyers, and ordinary people who simply value their privacy, made a move that said everything. Signal published an update to their desktop application that added a new setting called Screen Security. This setting, when enabled, blocks Windows Recall from taking screenshots of a default for all Windows users. The message was clear without a single word needing to be said about it. One of the world's most respected privacy-focused applications looked at what Microsoft had built and decided that the only correct response was to make sure Recall could not see inside their app at all. Later, in July 2025, two other major applications, Brave Browser and AdGuard, added similar recall blocking functionality. For international settlements alongside China, Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, and Thailand, it allows cross-border payments using digital currencies, including China's digital yuan, completely outside the SWIFT network. No American bank involved, no American oversight, no American veto power. Saudi Arabia joining mBridge was not just symbolic, it was structural. It was Riyadh officially putting one foot into a parallel financial universe. A universe where American sanctions do not exist, where American pressure has no lever, where Washington is simply not in the room. Picture what this means in practice. Saudi Arabia sells oil to China. China pays in digital yuan through the mBridge platform. Saudi Arabia's central bank converts those yuan into physical gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange vaults built on Saudi soil. The entire transaction, from the oil well to the gold vault, happens without a single American bank being involved, without a single SWIFT message being transmitted, without a single moment where Washington has any visibility, any leverage, or any power to say no. This is not a theory. This is not a future scenario. The infrastructure for exactly this transaction exists today. Right now, it is operational. And while all of this was happening in the financial world, China was simultaneously moving on a front that America had always considered its most sacred, most untouchable advantage in the Middle East: military power. America had been Saudi Arabia's security guarantor since the mid-1970s. United States military bases sat on Saudi soil. American aircraft carrier groups patrolled the Persian Gulf. American Patriot missile systems protected Saudi cities from aerial attack. American F-15 fighter jets flew from Saudi airfields. The arrangement was written in steel and jet fuel. America protects Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia prices its oil in dollars. It was the core bargain that kept the whole system running. But China began quietly, carefully inserting itself into this military relationship as well. S displayed some of their most advanced military hardware. In a moment that drew gasps from military observers, the J-10 fighter jet, China's frontline combat aircraft, conducted its first ever live aerial refueling demonstration outside Chinese territory, in front of Saudi military officials, in front of international delegations, on Saudi soil. China was not whispering anymore. China was announcing. Then, in early 2025, the Chinese Navy and the Royal Saudi Naval Forces conducted their third joint maritime exercise together. The operation was called Blue Sword 2025. 2 full weeks of coordinate TED drills in the waters of the region. Chinese and Saudi sailors working side by side, training together, learning each other's communication systems. And the technology relationship goes even deeper than weapons and warships. Saudi Arabia's entire economy is currently in the middle of a historic transformation called Vision 2030. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's sweeping plan to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil dependency and position the kingdom as a global hub for technology, tourism, entertainment, and innovation. This transformation requires enormous investment in the most advanced technologies available: artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum research, telecommunications infrastructure, smart city architecture, renewable energy systems. And China has positioned itself as the primary technology partner for nearly all of it. Huawei, China's telecommunications giant, the company that the United States has spent years lobbying every allied government on earth to ban, has deep established roots inside Saudi Arabia's telecommunications infrastructure. Much of the kingdom's national network runs on Huawei equipment. Saudi Aramco, the most valuable company in the history of the world, the absolute crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's economy, uses DeepSeek, a Chinese artificial intelligence platform, at its data centers. Chinese technology companies have begun construction of massive data centers in both Riyadh and Jeddah. These facilities will process and store some of the most commercially and strategically sensitive industrial data generated anywhere in the world. Data about oil production, data about energy infrastructure, data about the economic heartbeat of the entire Middle East. Or known as KAUST, right there inside Saudi Arabia. KAUST is not a standard academic institution. It is the absolute center of Saudi Arabia's ambition to become a global leader in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing. Having Chinese military-linked researchers embedded inside that institution is not a cultural exchange program. It is intelligence access. It is a window into technologies that will define military and economic supremacy for the next 100 years. And China has a seat at the table inside Saudi Arabia's most sensitive research institution. When Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December 2022, The reception he received was unlike anything the Arab world had staged for a foreign leader in recent memory. Saudi fighter jets were repainted in the colors of the Chinese flag to escort his plane as it descended. Saudi military units performed full ceremonial honors. The red carpet stretched further than protocol demanded. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not just a welcome. This was a statement to Washington, and to the entire world, about which direction the wind was beginning to blow. During that single visit, Saudi Arabia and China signed 34 separate agreements worth $30 billion. $30 billion. In a single state visit. The deals covered green energy, information technology, cloud services, artificial intelligence initiatives, transportation infrastructure, and construction, including technologies with clear potential for dual use in both civilian and military applications. But perhaps the most geopolitically explosive move China made in its Saudi strategy had nothing to do with money, weapons, or technology at all. Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain. Their mutual hostility had shaped the fractures and conflicts of an entire region for a generation. American diplomats had tried and failed repeatedly to bring these two deeply hostile powers into any form of meaningful dialogue. Washington had come to accept the Saudi-Iran rivalry as simply a permanent feature of Middle Eastern reality, a wound that would never close, something to be managed, never resolved. A neutral, trusted, capable mediator that both governments respected. And in March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran stood together before the world and announced a historic agreement to restore full diplomatic relations, an agreement brokered entirely, completely, and visibly by China. Not by the United States, not by the United Nations, not by any European power or Western institution, by China, the country that was supposed to be a regional outsider, the country that was supposed to lack the diplomatic relationships needed for this kind of breakthrough. This was not simply a diplomatic achievement. This was a seismic announcement, a signal broadcast loud and clear to every government in the Middle East and to every power watching from anywhere on the globe. China is no longer just a trader in this region. China is a force that can accomplish things America cannot, a force that commands trust that America has lost, a force that can shape the future of the most strategically vital region on Earth in ways that Washington had convinced itself were impossible. And all of this, the petroleum, the oil for gold agreement, the $7 billion currency swap, the Enbridge membership, the 400% increase in arms transfers, the drone manufacturing deal, the Blue Sword joint exercises, the Huawei infrastructure, the DeepSeek integration, the KAUST research access, the $30 billion in deals from a single visit, the Iran-Saudi peace agreement, all of it taken together add enormous military spending required to continue its war in Ukraine. At $60, Russia starts drawing down its national savings fund. At $50, Russia starts facing the kind of economic crisis that historically leads to political instability. The price of Russia's Urals crude had already dropped more than 20% since the start of 2025, falling below that critical $60 level. So suddenly, the Saudi Arabia that had been widely described as betraying America to help Russia in 2022 was now the country quietly but effectively crushing the Russian economy in 2025. Not with tanks or diplomatic sanctions or public condemnations, but with oil, with the same weapon it had used against everyone else, simply by pumping more of it. The weapon that Saudi Arabia had once turned against American shale producers was now pointed at Moscow. And the thing that makes this both fascinating and genuinely important is that Saudi Arabia was not doing this for America. It was doing it because Trump had asked for lower prices, because Saudi Arabia wanted a stronger strategic relationship with Washington that would give it access to technology and investment, and because Saudi Arabia was engaged in a long-term battle for global market share against every other producer on Earth simultaneously. This brings us to the deepest truth at the center of everything you have just heard. What looks like betrayal from the outside is actually something much more calculated, much more consistent, and much more revealing than a simple act of disloyalty. Saudi Arabia has never been a traditional ally, not in the way the word is usually meant. It has always been a strategic partner of necessity, a relationship held together by mutually beneficial interests rather than shared values or genuine friendship. The Americans knew this at some level, but they kept acting as though the relationship was something deeper and more durable than the numbers behind it. And every time the numbers changed, they were caught off guard, because they were measuring the relationship in terms of history and sentiment and shared security commitments, while Saudi Arabia was measuring it purely in terms of oil prices, market share, budget requirements, and the best available deal on the table on any given day. China understood this calculus years before most American policymakers admitted it openly. China has been steadily building its relationship with Saudi Arabia for over a decade, signing energy agreements, building economic partnerships, and positioning itself as a reliable buyer without political conditions attached. Today, China buys more than a quarter of all Saudi oil exports. Now, Saudi Arabia has been quietly exploring the idea of settling some of those trades in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars, a shift that would sound purely technical to most people, but carries enormous geopolitical weight. The entire global oil market has been priced in American dollars since that 1945 agreement in the Great Bitter Lake. The so-called petrodollar system is one of the most important foundations of American global financial dominance. Every country that needs oil must first acquire dollars to buy it. That creates permanent global demand for American currency, permanently supporting American financial power. If Saudi Arabia begins selling significant amounts of oil in yuan, it starts chipping away at that foundation, slowly. But the direction matters. Russia understood the transactional nature of the Saudi relationship perfectly and never expected anything more from it. Putin used the OPEC Plus partnership pragmatically, to buy time, to generate revenue, to demonstrate to the world that Russia was not isolated, to keep the sanctions from being fully effective long enough to stabilize the Russian economy around a war footing. When Saudi Arabia pivoted away in 2025, Russia was hurt economically, be they not diplomatically surprised, because in this world, the only betrayal would be expecting something different from a partner who had always been exactly what it presented itself to be, an independent operator, placing its own interests above all other considerations, always. The United States has spent decades learning this lesson and then somehow forgetting it by the time the next crisis arrives. American policymakers keep assuming that because Saudi Arabia depends on American military protection, it will follow American political and economic leadership. But that assumption misses the other side of the equation. America also depends on Saudi Arabia for oil market stability, for regional security cooperation, for intelligence sharing, for influence across the Arab world, for preventing worse actors from filling the vacuum if the relationship collapsed. Both sides need each other, which means neither side holds all the cards. And when neither side holds all the cards, the relationship is a negotiation, not a command structure. The world order that was built in 1945 on that warship in the Great Bitter Lake is not collapsing overnight, but it is visibly, undeniably changing. The assumption that America protects and Saudi Arabia supplies was a deal designed for a specific historical moment, a moment when America was the sole superpower, when oil dependency was total and there were no alternative sources, and when there were no other major powers with the ability or the interest to offer Saudi Arabia a competing partnership. That moment is long gone. China is fully at the table. Russia, despite its economic difficulties, remains a significant player. And Saudi Arabia has options that it simply did not have in 1945 or 1973 or even in 2000. When you have options, you use them. Not out of ingratitude, not out of hostility. Simply because that is what any rational actor does when the strategic environment changes. The 80-year relationship between America and Saudi Arabia is not over. It will not end. It is too embedded in the structure of global power, too mutually necessary, too practically important to simply dissolve over a disagreement about oil production levels. But it has fundamentally changed in character. It will never again be the automatic, almost unconditional partnership that defined most of the 20th century. From this point forward, every significant decision will be negotiated rather than assumed. Every major deal will be conditional rather than guaranteed. Every alliance will be tested against the only question that Saudi Arabia has clearly decided is the one that truly matters above all others. What does Riyadh get out of this? And in a world where that is the governing question, nobody is a permanent friend. Nobody is a permanent enemy. Every nation is a potential partner for exactly as long as the relationship serves Tezumts. National interest. That is not cynicism. That is not moral failure. That is the new, honest, openly admitted reality of global power in a multipolar world where multiple great powers compete for influence simultaneously. And the sooner Washington truly internalizes that reality, not just acknowledges it intellectually in think tank reports, but actually builds its foreign policy around it, the better it will be at maintaining the relationships it needs on terms that actually hold. Because Saudi Arabia did not betray America out of spite or ideology or some grand geopolitical realignment. Saudi Arabia just stopped pretending that the relationship was something it had never actually been. It was always a deal. It was always conditional. It was always about oil and security and money and leverage. And in the new multipolar world where China rises, ST, here America struggles to hold its position. Saudi Arabia is not choosing sides in some great moral conflict. It is sitting exactly where it has always wanted to sit, at the center of the global energy system, holding the tap in its hands, deciding who gets relief and who feels pressure, making itself indispensable to every player simultaneously, and answering to nobody but the interests of the kingdom itself. That is not a betrayal. That is a strategy. A cold, patient, extraordinarily effective strategy that has been running continuously since 1945. The only difference now is that Saudi Arabia is finally willing to let the world see it clearly. And the real question, the question that will define the next decade of global energy and global power, is whether America is finally ready to see it clearly too. Because the countries that understand Saudi Arabia for what it actually uncomfortable reality underneath that bravado. The Wall Street Journal did not make the story up. The New York Times did not make it up. NPR did not make it up. Every major outlet that ran this story had multiple sources. Sources inside the Pentagon, sources inside the National Security Council, sources with direct knowledge of what was said in that Situation Room. These were not anonymous internet rumors. These were sourced, verified, cross-referenced reports from reporters who have covered the American military for decades. So either Trump is right that the reporting is wildly exaggerated, or there's a deliberate, organized effort inside his own Defense Department to shape public perception of his war plans. And you can decide which of those two possibilities frightens you more. Because let us look at the full picture of what these leaks actually achieved. Think about this strategically for a moment. When the Pentagon leaks a story saying the military is not ready for a sustained campaign, that it lacks the munitions for a prolonged conflict, that aircraft carriers need servicing, what does that do? It handcuffs the President of the United States in public. If Trump now orders a large-scale strike on Iran and things go wrong, he cannot say he was not warned. The warning is in the newspaper. The warning is on the record. Every casualty, every setback, every crisis would be traced back to those front-page stories and the president who ignored them. That is not just military advice, that is political protection. And it raises a question that people inside Washington are genuinely arguing about. Is the Pentagon warning Trump because they care about the mission or because they want their own hands clean when the history books are written? Now zoom out even further because the Pentagon leaks are only one part of this fractured picture. The confusion does not stop at the Pentagon's gates. It extends all the way to the top of the Trump administration itself, where the president's own team cannot seem to agree on what they're actually trying to do with Iran. On one side, you have Vice President J.D. Vance. He has been clear, consistent, and direct. The goal, he says, is not regime change. The United States is not at war with the Iranian people. It is not trying to topple the Ayatollah. The target is singular, Iran's nuclear program. Stop the bombs from being built and the crisis is over. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has echoed the same line, clean, focused, limited. And then Donald Trump opens his phone. On the exact same days that Vance was delivering that measured message, Trump posted on social media asking, and this is a real quote from the sitting President of the United States, why there should not be regime change if Iran cannot, in his words, make Iran great again. He finished that post with the letters MEGA. It was not a joke. It was not a hypothetical. It was the President of the United States publicly contradicting his own Vice President and his own Defense Secretary in a social media post in the middle of nuclear negotiations, while two aircraft carriers were positioned for possible combat operations, or at the wrong angle, going everywhere except back where they came from. The F-35 uses a design philosophy called edge alignment, ENT, where every single external edge of the aircraft, every surface, every panel joint, every inlet and exhaust, is deliberately angled at the same consistent angles. This eliminates random reflections. It means there are no accidental flat surfaces that would bounce radar energy cleanly back to the source. Then there is the radar-absorbent material that coats the surface of stealth aircraft. This is not paint in the traditional sense. This is a carefully engineered material, classified in its specific composition, that literally absorbs radar energy and converts it to heat rather than bouncing it back. It eats the radar signal before it can reflect. The engine intakes are also specifically shaped to hide the radar-reflective spinning blades of the turbine inside, because those rotating metal blades would otherwise act like a radar beacon, bouncing energy directly back toward any radar looking at the front of the aircraft. Everything is considered. Everything is designed to reduce detection. And then on top of all the physical stealth features, there is active infrared management, Measures taken to reduce the heat signature of the jet's exhaust so that heat-seeking infrared tracking systems also lose the target. By T, heat time you account for all of these layers working together simultaneously, you have an aircraft that is not just hard to detect. You have an aircraft that is essentially invisible against almost all of the radar and tracking technology that Iran currently operates. But Iran's weakness against stealth jets goes far beyond the technology gap between American aircraft and Iranian radar systems. Because the night that Iran was struck was not the beginning of Iran's vulnerability. It was the culmination of a process that had been building for 9 consecutive days before a single American dicey and devastating campaign targeting Iran's air defense infrastructure specifically. For 9 straight days, Israeli F-35s, F-15Is, and F-16Is struck radar stations, missile batteries, command and control centers, and communication hubs across Iran. And by the time the American strike package arrived 9 days later, Iran's air defense network had already been profoundly and systematically damaged. Israeli strikes destroyed approximately 120 Iranian air defense launchers, roughly 1/3 of Iran's total air def, and say inventory before the conflict began. Radar sites that once provided coverage over critical approach corridors into Iranian airspace, silenced. Command centers that coordinated the link between radar detection and missile engagement, destroyed. The communication infrastructure that allowed DIF or K to share data with each other, severed in multiple places. Iran arrived at the night of June 22nd, not just facing American stealth technology. Iran arrived at that night already, missing 1/3 of its defensive capability, already struggling with broken communication chains, and already operating under the psychological weight of 9 consecutive days of watching its defenses get systematically dismantled. This leads directly to one of the most fundamental and deep-seated failures in Iran's air defense, a failure that existed long before June 2025, long before the Israeli strikes, long before any of this began. That failure is called integration failure, and it is the single most important structural weakness that explains why Iran's air defense behaves less like a coherent defensive system and more like a collection of isolated weapon systems that happen to be located in the same country. A truly effective modern air defense network, K, works like a living nervous system. Every radar station that detects something sends that information instantly and automatically through a secure, high-speed digital network to a central command center. The command center analyzes the threat, identifies it, determines which missile battery is best positioned to engage, and sends targeting data to that battery. The battery receives the data, the radar locks on, and the missile fires, all of this happening within seconds of the initial detection. Every link in that chain must work perfectly, and all of those links must work simultaneously in real time, or the entire system loses its ability to respond effectively. Analysis of Iran. As Air Defense Command infrastructure revealed that their system suffered from serious data integration problems, operating in a disjointed manner where radar stations, missile batteries, and command centers, other in real time. They were separate islands of capability rather than one connected, responsive, intelligent defense network. And when stealth jets that are already nearly invisible on radar operate inside a fragmented network like that, even the rare radar system that might catch a fleeting partial glimpse of an approaching stealth aircraft cannot communicate that information fast enough, accurately enough, or reliably enough to a missile battery for that battery to do anything meaningful about it. The window of opportunity to detect, track, and engage a stealth jet is already impossibly narrow. Inside a broken network, that window does not just narrow further, it effectively disappears entirely. Now, let's be precise about exactly what Iran had in terms of hardware, because Iran did not invest nothing in its air defense. Iran invested seriously. Iran spent years and enormous financial resources building a layered air defense system. The centerpiece of Iran's long-range air defense was the Russian-built S-300 PMU-2, a system acquired in 2016 after years of diplomatic and legal battles to secure the purchase. Cited one of Russia's most sophisticated air defense exports. The S-300 made Western military planners take Iran's air defense seriously. It was the system that Pentagon analysts pointed to when discussing the difficulty of any potential military operation against Iran. And here is what happened to every single S-300 battery Iran possessed. Why? In October 2024, 8 months before Operation Midnight Hammer, Israel conducted a series of precision airstrikes and destroyed all of Iran's active S-300 batteries. Everyone. Completely gone. So by the time American B-2 bombers were crossing the Atlantic toward Iran in June 2025, the system that had made Iran's air defense credible for nearly a decade was already 8 months in the past tense. Iran also developed and deployed its own domestically built air defense system called the Bavar 373. Iranian officials described it publicly as Iran's indigenous answer to the S-300. And in some press conferences and military parades, they claimed it was actually superior to Russian systems. They said it could track multiple targets simultaneously. They said it had a range that exceeded the S-300. They said the upgraded version, featuring a missile called the Syed-4B, could engage targets at up to 300 kilometers and track up to 300 separate targets at once. And Iran pointed to the Bavar 373 as the pride of its domestic defense industry, proof that Iran could develop world-class military technology independent of foreign suppliers. On a test range, against known targets flying predictable flight paths in controlled conditions, the Bavar 373 may well perform as advertised. But there's a fundamental difference between test range performance and combat performance, when every variable is working against you at once, when stealth jets are approaching from unexpected vectors, when electronic jamming is flooding your radar frequencies with noise, when your communication links have been degraded by 9 days of Israeli strikes, when your command structure has been disrupted, and when the approaching aircraft are flying profiles specifically designed to exploit every weakness in your system simultaneously. Under those real-world, real combat conditions, the Bavar 373 produced the same result as everything else Iran had on the night of June 22nd. Complete silence. Iran also had the Khordad-15 system, another domestically developed air defense weapon that Iranian state media covered extensively with great pride. The Khordad-15 uses a passive phased array radar and was specifically designed, according to Iranian military officials, to detect and engage stealth aircraft. Iranian television programs showed simulations of the Khordad-15 tracking and destroying F-35 fighters. Iranian commanders gave interviews claiming the system could detect stealth jets at 85 kilometers and engage them within 45 kilometers. The narrative inside Iran was that the Khordad-15 represented a genuine breakthrough, that Iran had solved the stealth problem. What the Khordad-15 actually demonstrated on the night of June 22, 2025, and during the 9 days of Israeli strikes before it, was that there is an enormous difference between a simulated capability and a proven one. Iranian radar operators and missile crews never got a reliable targeting solution on incoming stealth aircraft. The systems that survived Israeli strikes were not able to generate the kind of clean, sustained radar lock required to actually fire a missile with any realistic probability of hitting a fifth-generation stealth jet. And many of the Khordad-15 batteries that might have been positioned to try simply were not there anymore, having already been struck in the preceding days of the conflict. Beyond the hardware failures, there's a dimension of this story that most people never hear about, and it is arguably the most decisive factor in why Iran is completely blind to American stealth operations. That dimension is electronic warfare. The United States military does not send stealth jets into hostile airspace alone. Alongside every stealth strike package operates a fleet of specialized aircraft whose entire purpose is not to drop bombs, but to attack the electromagnetic spectrum itself, to reach out invisibly through the air and destroy Iran's ability to use its own radar systems. The primary weapon for this is the EA-18G Growler, a highly specialized aircraft derived from the FA-18 Super Hornet. But instead of bombs and missiles, it carries powerful jamming pods that emit high-power electronic signals, specifically tuned to the frequencies used by Iranian air defense radars. When an EA-18G Growler activates its jamming system, Iranian radar operators do not see stealth jets on their screens. They do not even see clean, empty screens. They see white noise, overwhelming, blinding interference that turns every radar display into chaos. The Growler identifies every frequency that an Iranian radar system is actively using, and then floods that frequency with so much electronic noise that the radar becomes useless. Iranian operators who are already struggling to detect stealth aircraft with radar cross-sections the size of marbles are now also fighting through electronic blizzards that make it impossible to tell the difference between an aircraft, interference, noise, and nothing at all. And then there is the trap that comes with attempting to fight back against jamming. If an Iranian radar operator, frustrated and desperate to find the incoming aircraft, decides to increase the power output of his radar, trying to push through the jamming by simply broadcasting more energy, that increased radar emission becomes a targeting signal. The United States has a weapon called the AGM-88 High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, or HARM. This missile is specifically designed to detect, home in on, and physically destroy radar transmitters. It follows the radar signal like a bullet following a muzzle flash. If an Iranian radar station increases its output trying to burn through electronic jamming, an AGM-88 is already in the air before the operator realizes what is happening, traveling at over twice the speed of sound directly toward the source of that radar signal. The message to every Iranian radar operator in the airspace that night was brutally simple. Turn on your radar and you will be killed. Stay silent and you are blind. There is no third option. Consider what the United States has been doing in parallel with all the public commitment ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. In 2019, 6 years before the June 2025 strikes, The U.S. quietly transferred the Combined Air and Space Operations Center from Al Udeid to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. The Washington Post was invited to observe what OFO officials called a dress rehearsal. Moving the command center off Qatar's soil back to the continental Unios, TED states, away from the 190-kilometer gap between Qatar and Iran. American officials described it as training and exercises. Arab News described it more bluntly. The Americans are re-practicing for a future where Al Udeid no longer exists. That transfer in 2019 was not widely discussed. It did not generate much coverage. But it was a significant statement about how the United States internally assesses its own exposure. Udeid not run a dress rehearsal for relocating your most important regional command center unless you are seriously considering the scenario where relocation becomes necessary. The pattern, then, is this. Publicly, the United States deepens its commitment to Al Udeid, security guarantees, new command facilities, joint training, billions in Qatari investment. The relationship is stronger than ever. Privately, the United States practices leaving, moves command functions to South Sierra Leone, evacuates